revamped the intro music for this week and probably following weeks. We'll probably keep that for a while. I didn't really have anything planned for the Christmas season this year or anything like that for the show. I just kind of decided to stay out of the argument altogether. You know, there are some Christians who say we shouldn't celebrate and some Christians who say that we should, and I'm just going to stay out of that altogether. So the closest thing that I have to any kind of Christmas gift for the listeners or anything like that is just some new intro music, and I think it's pretty cool. I think it's needed. The intro music we had before was fine, but now it's a little more interesting, so we'll probably be keeping that. Now, today we are going to be talking about Zechariah 5 and focusing on the flying scroll and the Ephah. And that's going to be our study for today. The whole scope of this show, I know I've been having a lot of interviews lately, which has just been awesome. It's been phenomenal. And I love being able to do that. But we're not going to be able to do that every single week. This isn't... The Sharpening isn't a show where we're always going to have somebody on. Now, I'll do it as often as I can and as much as people want to be on the show that, you know, have something worthwhile to say. I'll definitely have them on, but I can't guarantee I can do that every single week. So I kind of look at the show as, you know, it's sharpening each other, you know, all of our brethren here. You know, we're supposed to sharpen one another, as Proverbs says. So sometimes we can do that with a Bible study like we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking into some pretty interesting things. But other times that can be done with having on a guest as well to assist in the sharpening. So some days we'll be doing that. Other days we'll just be having a study like today. And the only difference is instead of hearing two voices, you'll have to listen to my voice drone on and on for an hour and a half or so, depending how long the show goes. That's the other thing too, is that I know that the times of the show, they can be a little inconsistent. Sometimes, you know, they're only an hour and a half, couple hours. And I do that for a reason, because I don't want to set a time limit for if I have somebody on who wants to speak longer, or if the interview runs long, such as when we had on Rob Skiba. That was definitely an interview I would not have wanted to cut short. So instead, I decided it was best to just split it up into two parts. But same goes on the other end. I don't want a guest to feel like they have to make up content to fill up time. You know, if they only have even half an hour, let's say, then we'll have them on. Now, I'm going to try to make each show last at least an hour, but sometimes, you know, just depending on the content or what's being discussed or, you know, what's going on at the time, it might even be a little shorter than that. It might be longer than an hour and a half. I just don't want to get tied into time constraints as much as I can help it. And there are at times where we have to do that a little bit, but the main focus that I want to have on here is just getting into the Word and finding out how best we can sharpen each other. And I just don't want any kind of time limit on that, whether it takes half an hour or only an hour, or whether it takes 3 or 4 hours. I just want to let God kind of handle all that. So there's no real time limit for the show. Every week's going to be a little different. And, normally I'm not going to have a show last any more, than an hour and a half or 2 hours, because at that point I would just split it up into 2 episodes. So if you're planning on listening every week, you don't have to think that you're going to have to sit there for 3 hours straight. That's probably not going to happen. If anything, that it would be split up. But, so that being said, I wanted to get that out of the way. Also, before we get into our study into Zechariah, I want to announce a new book that I have just released. Actually, the only thing I wrote in the book is the foreword, because it's actually a gospel harmony, and it's called Peck's Harmony of the Gospels, a chronological gospel harmony from the King James Version Bible. Now, what a gospel harmony is it's an attempt to take the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and combine them into one sort of one narrative or one storyline. Most of the time, this is done by splitting up the Gospels into parallel columns. And so when you open the page, you'll have 4 columns, each representing a Gospel, and it'll be split up that way. While that's all fine and good, it makes it kind of difficult to read, at least to me, and to a lot of other reviews that I've read out there. So what I've done is I've combined them all into one text. It reads just like a book, but I've split up the gospel accounts by font emphasis in the print version, and then by color in the ebook. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In the print version, well, actually, we'll start with the ebook. That's easier to explain. In the ebook, that one is actually called Peck's Harmony of the Gospels, a color-coded and chronological gospel harmony from the King James Version Bible, and that it's split up by color. So with each, when the gospel changes, or when when it switches from, let's say, Mark to Luke or something, the color changes to tell you that it's a different speaker. And I tried to compile it in a way as if you can picture sitting in a room with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all right there with you, and they're telling you the story of Jesus and of just the whole gospel. Now, while they're all 4 sitting there, they're all going to have some different ideas about it, and they're going to each take their own turn to speak, but they're going to be adding things when somebody, it's just like a regular conversation. That's how this is written. So it's split up by chronology, and it just takes the 4 gospels and meshes them together basically into one kind of super gospel. So the ebook, it's split up by color, and I've done everything I can to make this as easy to read as possible. I mean, I've researched other gospel harmonies out there, and I really do believe this one is the easiest one to read and understand. Now, I wanted to offer the color-coded in a print version, but in order to do that, because printing in color is so expensive, I would have had to charge over $40 for the book, and I did not want to do that to you guys. So instead, I have the print version. It's in black and white, but instead of being split up by color, it's split up by font emphasis. And what that means is, depending on the gospel, some text is bold, some text is underlined, some text is italicized. So in the color version, you have Matthew in purple, Mark in red, Luke in green, and John in blue. In the print version, it's Matthew is in regular text, Mark is underlined, Luke is italicized, and John is bold. So it's still easy to read, and it's easy to pick out what's what. I've also included the book, chapter, and verse number every time an account changes, or every time it switches gospels. So if you want to check that out, I have them both on my website, www.ministudyministry.com, and for right now, probably until the new year, I'm offering the print version for the low price of $12.99. It's the absolute cheapest that I can offer it right now, and I can't keep it at that price forever, but I'm going to hold off as long as I can. What I would love is if you could order a copy, and if you could leave a review on Amazon for me, that would be great. And just be honest. I'm not gonna sit there and beg you for 5 stars or anything. If you want to, great. But if you don't feel that's adequately describes the book, then don't. Be honest. But I would love it if you could write reviews, because in the future I'm going to be releasing more editions of this with commentary and so on and so forth. But so the ebook, I don't have the price. Well, the ebook price is on the website. I think it's $6.99 or $7.99 or something like that. I don't have it right in front of me, but the ebook that's the set price for, that's not going to change. But the price in the print copy for right now, I can offer it for $12.99. In the future, within a couple of weeks or so, I'm going to have to put it, back up to where it's actually affordable, or where I can actually keep it going, because I unfortunately cannot keep it at $12.99 forever, though I would love to. So it's called Peck's Harmony of the Gospels. You can find it on my website. You can find it on Amazon. So that being said, that is the yeah, that's the new book out from me. Now, the study that we're getting into today, Zechariah chapter 5, this flying scroll in the Ephah, this is actually research that comes from my next full-length book. This isn't a mini study book. It's a full-length book. It's sort of loosely kind of like a part 2 to Disclosure. It builds off of what Disclosure, my book Disclosure, what that started. But you don't have to read Disclosure to be able to understand this next coming book. Now, this book isn't out yet. It's not going to be out for a little while yet. I don't have a title for it yet. Something based around shadow or something to that effect, because that's essentially what it's about. But this is research from what is going into that book. So you can kind of look at this episode as a preview for what my next book's about. Now, what we're getting into today, we're going to be getting into some strange things, because Zechariah is a strange book, especially chapter 5. But as far as my book, the Shadow book, or whatever it's going to be called, as far as that goes, this is actually pretty tame compared to what else is going into the book. I have some pretty wild stuff that it's confirmed biblically. There are possibilities of truth. I'm not going to say something's absolute truth unless I know for sure. But there's a lot of that, and basically what the book's going to be based around is that everything that we experience is just a shadow of something bigger. I'll just leave it at that, because I don't want to give too much away. So the study that we're going to be getting into right here in a moment is research from the next book. So be sure to look for that. If you do want the foundation for the next book, of course, I would recommend getting my book Disclosure, because that will set you up to better understand the next book to come. But it's not a necessity. I'm going to be writing it in a way that it is a sort of part 2 to Disclosure, but loosely, because I want people to be able to understand the Shadow book, whatever it's going to be called, without having to read Disclosure. So I don't want you to feel like you have to buy 2 books in order to just read one, if that makes sense. So I think all the marketing stuff's out of the way now. I usually don't talk much in this show about my books or products, or at least, I reference them a lot, but I don't talk about them as if, go buy this, or this is how much this is. I don't want to use the show as a commercial, but it does have to do with what we're talking about. And I do really think that the gospel harmony would be is something anybody can enjoy. It's, for one thing, it is just in time for Christmas. If you go and order it now, it'll get there, in time. And no matter if you have, the strictest Baptist you can find, or if you have the most out there fringe Christian you can find, anybody's going to be able to appreciate this. So I wanted to put something out there that's not just for us fringe Christians, but something that can be helpful for anybody. And that's why I kept it in the King James version as well. It's for the benefit of the majority. That's usually why I quote from it, even though I do like other Bible versions, other translations a lot. I like the ESV, I like the NLT. There's a lot of good ones. I love the Septuagint, but I kept this one King James just for the benefit of the majority, but also so you can still have access to, like if you want to use Strong's Concordance to look stuff up, you can still do that, or Blue Letter Bible or whatever. So there's that. I think even if it's something you're not interested in, it'd be a great gift idea. And I've probably talked enough about that, so we can get into our our study. Now, in my next book, the working title for the chapter is the Zechariah prophecies, and anybody that's read Disclosure knows that in Disclosure I have a chapter called the Ezekiel prophecies, which got into some pretty strange things because Ezekiel's a pretty strange book. Same for Zechariah. So it's the same basic idea. I get into the scroll and the Ephah and a little bit more into the horses because I talked about the horses of Revelation compared to the horses of Zechariah 6. I talk about that in Disclosure and where that connection is, and I talk more about it in here. If we have time, I'll do a brief review, but it's something that we've brought up before in this show. But we'll see how far we get, how much time is left, and if we have time at the end, which we probably will. It's not a very long study. Then I'll get a little bit into the horses as well. So that I guess that just brings us right to it. Zechariah 5 is what we're going to be looking at. Now, a lot of people have said they've tried to make the connection between the flying scroll and a UFO, or the Ephah and a UFO. Now, I can see I can see that with the Ephah, at least to what we're going to look at to a certain extent. Now, I obviously, anybody who knows me, I don't believe this is talking about aliens or anything like that. But I do believe that there are fallen angels out there that are promulgating a lie about extraterrestrials trying to deceive, the world away from God, because these aliens claim to be our creators and all that. And I can see possibilities of some parallels with that in the Ephah. Not so much in the scroll, personally. Now, there are those that would disagree with me. That's fine. I think there are those that would agree with me as well. So we're going to look at the scroll first because it's a bit easier to understand. It's not as in-depth, and also it's just the first in the vision, so that makes it easy. But there are still a lot of really awesome parallels just all throughout the Bible from this. We find Zechariah's vision of the flying scroll in Zechariah 5, 1 through 4, which reads, "Then I turned and lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a flying roll. And he said unto me, What seest thou? And I answered, I see a flying roll, the length thereof is 20 cubits, and the breadth thereof 10 cubits. Then said he unto me, This is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. For every one that stealeth shall be cut off, as on this side according to it, and every one that sweareth shall be cut off, as on that side according to it. I will bring it forth, saith the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter into the house of the thief, and into the house of him that sweareth falsely by my name, and it shall remain in the midst of his house, and shall consume it, with the timber thereof and the stones thereof." All right. Now, a little bit of background. When it says in verse 2, "And he said unto me, What seest thou?" That's an angel that's with Zechariah through these visions that he's having. So that's who he's talking to. So he sees this giant scroll. We can, now that we have a basic understanding of the section, this is the entire vision, by the way. This verses 1 through 4 is the whole vision of the scroll. Now that we have that, we can begin to break it down. The first verse tells us that Zechariah looked up and he saw something called a flying roll. Now, at first glance, it might be kind of funny. We might picture a flying dinner roll flying across the sky or something like that, like a food fight on Thanksgiving or something, but that's not what we're talking about. Actually, the word roll comes from the Hebrew word Megillah, meaning roll, book, writing. This is not referring to a literal book as we would think of a book today. It's referring to a scroll. In technical terms, what we would consider as a book today, pages with binding and all that, that's actually called a codex. A book in ancient times would be in reference to a scroll. So when you read, book in verses like this, it's don't think of pages bound with a binding and hardcover and all that. It's actually a scroll. Also, what's interesting to note is that the Hebrew word used for flying could also imply a type of hovering. Zechariah saw a literal scroll that was flying / hovering in the air. And see, a lot of people might look at that and say, see, there, UFO. And, there was a time that I entertained that possibility, but after looking into it, what it is, what the whole reason for it being there, I just don't see it anymore, and we'll get into why. So we looked at okay, so that's the first verse. Now next, in the second verse, we learn the measurements of this flying scroll. We're told that the scroll is 20 cubits in length and 10 cubits in breadth. Zechariah just looks up and knows that. He can just tell. He wasn't launched up there to measure it. He just knew it. It's interesting that the exact measurements of the flying scroll are given, and as I said, it's equally interesting that Zechariah just knew it just by looking at it. And that was a question I had. How would he know? But especially since it's up in the air, it's really hard to judge measurements with something that's in the air. But when we look deeper, we can actually realize why, or how he knew that. Ezra 6:14 states, "And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia." So this here is speaking of the building of the second temple. What we find is that Zechariah was present at the building, and along with Haggai, he prophesied over the elders of the Jews while they built. We know that this is the same Zechariah because it says Zechariah son of Iddo, and that's how Zechariah is introduced, or how he's described in the book of Zechariah. So it's the same guy. So he was there at the building of the second temple. He and Haggai were prophesying over the elders of the Jews while they built the temple. So given his job and the amount of involvement he had, not to mention all the scriptural references, Zechariah would have been well aware of the measurements used in the building of the temple. All right? So hold on to that. Zechariah knew what the measurements of the temple were. All right? Now, that doesn't fully explain the measurements of the scroll yet, but we're getting to that. So just hold on to that piece of information. Zechariah would have been familiar with the measurements of the temple. Now, 1 Kings 6:3 tells us that the porch of Solomon's temple was 20 cubits by 10 cubits. See? So there's that 20 by 10 measurement again. Now, given the fact that he was associated with the building of the temple, Zechariah was associated with the building of the temple, and the fact that he would have been aware of this measurement, we can begin to realize how it was Zechariah was able to immediately know the exact measurements of the flying scroll. He recognized the size of the scroll as matching the size of the porch of the temple. That's how he knew it was the same size. This has great significance when considering the meaning of Zechariah's vision of the flying scroll. Because in 1 Kings 7:7, it also tells us that it was from this porch, called the porch of judgment, where Solomon would judge. So when we look at the meaning of the scroll, which we're gonna look into, it's the same thing. It's a shadow of it. Solomon had this porch of judgment. This flying scroll goes to judge. It's sent forth as a judgment and a curse. So let's look at that. In the third verse of Zechariah here, Zechariah 5, in the third verse, Zechariah is told that the scroll is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. Now, it's important to note that this curse was not only for Israel. All right, this curse was meant for the entire population of the planet Earth. We're told that for everyone that stealeth shall be cut off as on this side according to it, and everyone that sweareth shall be cut off as on that side according to it. So this is a judgment for two very specific sins, stealing and swearing. The judgment of being cut off it's not the same as we would normally think. Usually when we think of cut off, we think of like an execution, like one person is being executed. But here, the Hebrew word for cut off is nakah, meaning, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, by the way. I don't know Hebrew, so I'm doing my best. I believe it's pronounced nakah, meaning to be cleaned out or purged out. So the implication here is that whoever will commit these sins will be utterly wiped out, collectively and completely cleared out of the way. Now, that's a far harsher judgment than just a single personal execution of sorts. It's more of a purification process for the entire earth to remove those who commit the sins. And anybody who's taken a look at my book, Day of the Lord, knows the implications there of this purifying process. And also 4 Degrees of Baptism, another mini-study book I wrote, because that talks about the more personal way, like what we're going to be going through this purification, what that means for us. But anyway, back to our study. The 2 sins mentioned here are especially interesting. Now, considering the first sin mentioned, the word stealeth, it comes from the Hebrew word ganab, meaning to steal, steal away, or carry away. And the word sweareth comes from the Hebrew word shabah, meaning to swear or to curse. So what we have here are the sins of stealing and cursing. We learn that each sin is judged from either side of the flying scroll. Now that's really interesting too, because what's important to note is that typically a scroll would not have been written on both sides, such as it's described here. In ancient Israel, scrolls would be written on one side only. This scroll, however, is written on both sides, because it says it judges from this side this way and this side this way. It's written on both sides. Now, there are various shadows that can be looked at through this understanding. The first and probably most important shadow that can be found is that of the 10 Commandments. And what do I mean when I say shadow? I mean it's like a reflection or a copy of a higher, more important thing, or of something of equal or greater value, we can say. So that's what I mean by a shadow. So we could look at this as a shadow of the 10 Commandments, and here's how we can make that connection. When we look at the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, that gives us the 10 Commandments in their proper order. Now we must remember that the 10 Commandments were presented on 2 slabs of stone. So there were 5 commandments on each slab. This is a direct shadow to the 2 sides of the flying scroll. And we can prove this further if we look at the very center of each slab. In the middle commandment, in the list of each 5, we see an interesting parallel. The 3rd commandment, being the very middle of the first slab of stone, is the commandment against taking the name of the Lord in vain. Essentially, that's referring to cursing against God. It's cursing, the sin of cursing. The 8th commandment, which would be the middle commandment on the 2nd slab of stone, that's the commandment against stealing. So the sins of cursing and stealing are the very sins that the flying scroll is sent to bring judgment upon. The flying scroll, it can be looked at as a shadow of the 10 Commandments, but also the subsequent judgments. So it's just so amazing that God, he's not limited. Many times he'll have a single object be a shadow of many different things. So we can look at it as the 10 Commandments, but we can also look at it as other things. But there's always a common thread connecting them. That's how we know we haven't gone off the deep end, because we have to watch out for that too. We got to take everything in context and not go crazy with this stuff. So God can use a single thing like the scroll. It could be a shadow of the 10 Commandments. We could see it's a shadow of some other things too. And as long as we have that common thread to tie them all together, we know we're on the right track. So when we go back to the idea of the scroll being written on both sides, we can find more shadows throughout the Bible. Ezekiel 2, verse 7 through chapter 3, verse 4, that passage reads, "And thou shalt speak my words unto them, whether they will hear or whether they will forbear, for they are most rebellious. But thou, son of man, hear what I have..." Let me start that again. I'm just going to start from verse 7 of chapter 2, and we'll just go through that again. All right. And thou shalt speak my words unto them, whether they will hear or whether they will forbear, for they are most rebellious. But thou, son of man, hear what I say unto thee. Be not thou rebellious like that rebellious house. Open thy mouth and eat what I give thee. And when I looked, behold, an hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without. And there was written therein lamentations, and mourning, and woe. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest. Eat this roll, and go speak unto the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. And he said unto me, Son of man, go, get thee unto the house of Israel, and speak my words unto them. So that's the passage. Ezekiel was given a scroll that was written on both sides, just like the flying scroll of Zechariah is described. Ezekiel was commanded to eat this scroll, which was as sweet as honey. For some of you, that might sound familiar. We're going to look into that as well. It was through eating of this scroll that Ezekiel was able to speak with the words of God himself. So the scroll, in essence, was the word of God. We could look at it like that. We can clearly see that the flying scroll contained the word of God as well. This is also reminiscent of another scroll mentioned in the book of Revelation. Revelation 10, 8 through 11 reads, And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again, and said, Go and take the little book, which is open in the hand of the angel, which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel, and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it, and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, and it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand, and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples, and nations, and tongues, and kings. All right, so this is another important shadow to consider. John was commanded to eat the book, which is the same thing as the scroll is used in this. It's a scroll, is used in this passage, and it was sweet as honey, just like the passage in Ezekiel we looked at. So we also learned that it was bitter in John's stomach. Now this scroll, just like the scroll Ezekiel was commanded to eat, it allowed John to prophesy to the whole world. The only difference is that Ezekiel's scroll was only to prophesy to Israel, whereas, John's was to prophesy to the entire world. So that might be the reason that John's scroll became bitter in his stomach. I don't know for sure, but it could be that because it was for the entire world at the last of the last times, the importance and burden was heavier, maybe. In that sense, we could see the scroll of Ezekiel meant to prophesy to the land of Israel as a shadow for the future scroll of John that would be meant to prophesy to the entire world. All right, so the Ezekiel scroll could be a shadow of the John scroll. So the parallels line up there, at least as possibilities. Now, the last shadow we'll look at for the flying scroll of Zechariah is found in the 5th chapter of Revelation. This shadow is especially interesting given its prophetic importance. Revelation 5:1 reads, And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. So again, just like in Revelation 10, the book here is the same thing as a scroll. And the first thing we can realize is that the scroll is written on both sides, just as the flying scroll of Zechariah and the scroll of Ezekiel. So when reading the entire chapter, we discover that it is Jesus who possesses this scroll. The scroll is sealed by 7 seals, which represent judgments to come upon the earth as each seal is broken. So the idea of judgment ties back to Solomon's porch of judgment and the measurement of Zechariah's scroll. Zechariah's vision was a shadow of the scroll in Revelation chapter 5, as it is described as being written on both sides and bringing about judgment. So we have a shadow there. Also, as a quick side note, and this might not be anything, but I just thought this was interesting. We read in Revelation 5:6 that the Lamb Jesus had 7 eyes, which represent his 7 spirits. This might have something to do with the stone in Zechariah 3:9. If you're interested, you can look that up. It's Zechariah 3:9. The stone, which also is described as having 7 eyes. Now, this would make sense because this stone in Zechariah is said to be engraved, much like the stone in Revelation 2:17, where we're told of the white stone that contains a new name for those who receive it. So Zechariah 3:8 makes mention of Jesus Christ as the branch, and in the very next verse it describes the stone with 7 eyes, as well as mentions that God will remove the iniquity of the land in that day. So comparing it with Revelation, it's clear the same thing could be, the case could be made that the same thing is being described. Now, what all of that means and what all the ins and outs of it, I have no idea. I just I just thought it was really cool and really interesting. So, but anyway, going back to the flying scroll of Zechariah, we can realize that the scroll is not mentioned as having any kind of seals attached. The scroll of Zechariah has no seals attached, such as the one in the book of Revelation. So since the scroll in Zechariah is already bringing about judgment, it'd be safe to assume that the seals have already been broken and the flying scroll is not bound by the seals. So this could make sense due to the fact that the scroll is sent to execute a judgment of a complete purging of the sinners on earth. So this, in my humble opinion, is a direct reference or a shadow of the day of the Lord. And again, I write more about the day of the Lord in my mini-study book, Day of the Lord. Easy to remember. So we must remember, too, that Zechariah saw the scroll flying/hovering for some time before the judgment came. This means that there could have been time for other events to transpire within the prophetic timeline as described in Revelation. This would seem to make sense given Zechariah's next vision. The second vision that completes the 5th chapter of Zechariah is the vision of the Ephah, and the vision of the Ephah is what we will be looking at next. All right. So the vision of the Ephah and the vision of the flying scroll, they both had their fair share of speculation throughout history of what these things could be representing, or what these things mean. Nowadays, there are many people that will try and attribute the vision of the scroll and the vision of the Ephah to UFOs, the alien gospel, coming great deception, all that stuff, like I said earlier. Now, again, I don't see any biblical evidence to support the idea of the flying scroll representing a type of UFO or similar craft piloted by fallen angels masquerading as our alien creators. Although I don't see it in the flying scroll, I do see biblical evidence for that in the vision of the Ephah. The evidence is what we'll be looking at in this section of the Bible study. So Zechariah chapter 5 through 11 reads, "Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, Lift up now thine eyes, and see what is that goeth forth." What is this that goeth forth? Oh, there we go again. We're going to just start over again. I just keep doing that to you guys, but that's okay. You can hear it again. It's not going to hurt you. "Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, Lift up now thine eyes, and see what is this that goeth forth. And I said, What is it? And he said, This is an ephah that goeth forth. He said, moreover, This is their resemblance through all the earth. And behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. And he said, This is wickedness. And he cast it into the midst of the ephah, and he cast the weight of lead upon the mouth thereof. Then lifted I up mine eyes, and looked, and behold, there came out 2 women, and the wind was in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heaven. And said I to the angel that talked with me, Whether do these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, To build it an house in the land of Shinar, and it shall be established and set there upon her own base. All right, so there's our passage. Verses 5 and 6 give us the basic setup of the vision. Zechariah sees an ephah moving through the sky and is told, This is their resemblance through all the earth. Now, a very interesting thing to note is that the word used for resemblance can also just as easily mean eye, like your eye, what you see out of. And even some noted theologians have thought this to be the case. So, if this is referring to eye instead of resemblance, it would add a whole new dimension to the passage. Now, some have attributed it to the all-seeing eye connected to the Illuminati, the eye that you find on the back of your dollar bill. Others, me included, would take this back to our enemy Satan and his eye, whose establishment is destroyed by the hand of God. This is the message that is found when we consider the meanings of each Hebrew letter that make up the name of Jesus. And I know when we had Rob Skiba on, he mentioned that as well, and he talked a little bit about that. So we're going to go through what exactly that means. See, each Hebrew letter has its own unique meaning. So when you have a Hebrew word, you have the meaning of the word, but you also have the meaning of each letter that makes up the word to add further insight. The Hebrew name of Jesus is Yeshua, which is made up of the letters Yod, Shin, Vav, and Ayin. Now, Yod, the letter, the Hebrew letter Yod, means hand. See, each letter has a meaning. So Yod means hand. Shin means destroy. Vav means establishment. And Ayin means eye. So this can be further shown in John 3:8, which reads, "He that committeth sin is for the devil, and the devil sinneth from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil." So Yeshua's name actually means the hand that destroys the establishment of the eye. All right, so another interesting side note is the word used for resemblance is the same Hebrew word / letter ayin. That's the last letter in it's the last letter in Yeshua's name, meaning eye. So if this Ephah is their eye instead of their resemblance, then we have something very interesting. Now, while the word there is plural, I is singular. So this would mean that whatever the Ephah represents, they share a single eye of sorts. This could be the very establishment of the eye of the enemy that Jesus is to destroy. So it's definitely something to look at. Now, going back to the Ephah and what it might represent, we discover that the text is not completely clear as to who's being referred to as there. The most accepted answer for there is referring to the sinners back in the vision of the scroll. So when it says their resemblance, most people will say that it's referring back to the sinners. The idea is to go backwards throughout the text from the word there to find out what the subject is. Normally, the first subject that can fit is the right one when you go backwards. Normally, that's true. That's a good way to find out. But here it's a little bit more difficult to know for sure because we're within a completely new vision. Now, within this vision, the only subject that's been addressed is the Ephah itself. So if there is referring to the Ephah, then it would seem to say that there are multiple objects throughout the earth and they resemble this Ephah. If the word there is referring to the sinners in the previous vision, then the spiritual or metaphorical resemblance of the sinners is that of the Ephah. Now, that is, of course, if we are to go with the resemblance translation instead of the I translation. Either way, there is a cryptic meaning that seems to point to the very same thing. It doesn't matter when we look at it. It really doesn't matter if it's referring to I or if it's referring to resemblance. The meaning is the same, but in order to know that, we have to define what an Ephah actually is. So the word Ephah comes from the Hebrew word Ephah, basically, meaning a dry measure of quantity equal to 3 seahs, 10 omers, the same as the liquid measure bath, about 9 imperial gallons. Rabbinical writings give sizes of 1/2 this amount. and it also means the receptacle for measuring or holding that amount. All right, so what are we looking at? We can think of this in terms of a cup or a gallon, like how we would use it today. Much how we would have a cup of flour or a gallon of milk. It's the same principle for an ephah. The cup of flour is in reference to the measurement and the container. The cup of flour is contained in a cup. That's just how it is. Same goes for a gallon of milk. A gallon of milk is contained in a gallon. So that's exactly what we're looking at with Ephah. Ephah is the name of the measurement and the container. So since this is a vision that Zechariah is having, it would be referring to the container, not the measurement. If you have a measurement without a container, what's that going to look like? I don't know if you could even it'd just be like a ball of liquid up there. What would that look like? So it's referring, when we take it in context and realize it's a vision he's having, he has to see something. It's not just some amorphous blob of liquid or grain or whatever. It makes most sense that it's referring to the container. So that's what we're looking at. Now, if we can discover what the ephah container actually looks like in Zechariah's time, we'll have an easier time understanding what he saw. Now, in the book, in my book, that I'm going to have all this, and I'm going to have a picture of an ephah, but since this is just audio, you'll have to find it on your own. But when we look at what an ephah actually looks like, it really does resemble what we would think of as like a flying saucer. It's that type of UFO. It's pretty phenomenal how similar the two are. So when we look at that, even taking a quick glance at this, it should bring about new meaning to the idea of this being their resemblance or even their eye. If it's meant to be their resemblance and it's referring to the ephah itself, then what does this ephah resemble? Again, I would say it bears a striking resemblance to many of the UFOs that are being witnessed and reported. If it's meant as their resemblance and is referring back to the sinners of the flying scroll vision, then the more spiritual or metaphorical resemblance would be addressed. So, what do the UFOs promulgate? They are carriers of this lie, this curse to God, which states that we are created by aliens and not God. It's known as the alien gospel. So this would include all the other false doctrines that go along with that. They're stealing away the faith of many. They're stealing away people out of the church. We have references to both the sins that are dealt with in the flying scroll visions. We have stealing and a curse. So if it does mean their resemblance, and it's referring to the physical ephah, that makes sense. If it means their resemblance and is referring to the sinner's resemblance, and is using an ephah, the shape of the ephah to show that, well, that makes sense too. Because in both cases with this alien deception, we have the sins of stealing and cursing. Now, what about if it's meant their eye? What if it's not resemblance? What if it's eye? If it's meant as their eye and is referring back to the sinners of the flying scroll vision, well, this would fit too. The establishment of the eye of the enemy in the last days will be built upon a foundation of false doctrine, as we'll soon discover further evidence for later in the vision of the Ephah. But the false doctrine that causes the great apostasy, in all likelihood, will be or have something to do with the alien gospel. I believe it will. Look how big shows like Ancient Aliens and all this. I mean, it's all over the movies and TV shows. It's everywhere, and a lot of people believe in it. It totally strips God out of creation. I think it's more deceptive than even evolution because with evolution, we can at least look at the fossils themselves and kind of disprove it. I mean, they just found soft tissue inside of a dinosaur bone, so clearly it's not millions of years old. It can't be. The problem with the alien gospel is how do you disprove that? We can't. We don't have the means to go to the Pleiades and show that there's no aliens there, or that we can't. We have no way to really disprove it beyond just well, I mean, from our perspective, it'd be common sense. They're obviously lying. They can't get their story straight. They themselves have no proof. But the thing is, it's so deceptive. They don't even need proof. People are believing it anyway. So, I think that this alien gospel thing is even more deceptive than evolution, and it totally strips God out of the process. Now, so going back, if it means their eye and is referring to the sinners, that's what we could be looking at. But if it's meant as their eye and is referring to the Ephah itself, then it is plain and simple in meaning, and we can take it more literally. And see, that's what I like to do. I like to take things literally when I can, when it's called to do so in the Bible, which is quite a bit, simple and literal. Um, that's how the Bible, I believe, was meant to be read. Now, this ephah in the air, this UFO of sorts, it's a representation of the eye of the enemy. When we think of fallen angels misrepresenting themselves as aliens, this is how they watch us. They study us, find out how best to deceive us. So whichever of these four interpretations between their eye, their resemblance, and the sinners or the ephah itself, those are the four ways we could look at it. Whichever of the four interpretations is correct, they all lead back to the same exact thing. They all point to the alien gospel. I believe that's what we're looking at. I think that there's at least evidence to support that as a possibility. We can find further evidence to support this by looking at the rest of the vision. So Zechariah 5:7 reads, "And behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah." So, the word for talent refers to a weight and a circular shape when we take that back to the Hebrew. And also the word for sitteth denotes an act of dwelling or residing. It's not just that the woman was just sitting inside of the ephah. The woman dwelt there. She lived there. That was her residence. The ephah, yeah, it's her residence. So this could mean that her whole drive or motivation is contained in what she promulgates with this ephah. This could also have reference to the fall of the angels who lost their first estate and proper residence. We read about that in Jude and 2 Peter. And the fallen angels no longer have a home in heaven, but now seem to reside somewhere in the air, in the space between heaven and earth. Sometimes it's referred to as the second heaven. It's important to keep this in mind as we move forward. And if you want more information on that, again, I would suggest checking out my book Disclosure. I write quite extensively about that and the idea of angelic bodies, how spiritual bodies and physical bodies with an angel, how that works. But that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so keep that in mind as we go forward of this residing between heaven and earth, what's called the second heaven. We could think of that as the cosmos or outer space. So Zechariah 5:8 reads, "And he said, This is wickedness, and he cast it into the midst of the ephah, and he cast the weight of lead upon the mouth thereof." All right, so the name of the woman is wickedness. Another word for this could be lawlessness. It's basically the same thing, and it can be compared with the whore of Babylon, as we'll soon see. After identifying the woman, we discover what the purpose for the talent of lead is. This heavy circular piece of lead was being used as a lid to contain the woman inside the ephah. We discover the reason in the next 3 verses, which are the last 3 of the chapter and they end the vision of the ephah. So Zechariah 5:9 through 11 reads, "Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out 2 women, and the wind was in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the heaven and the earth. Then said I to the angel that talked with me, Whither do these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, To build it an house in the land of Shinar, and it shall be established, and set there upon her own base." So there is a lot to look at here. It's only 3 verses, but there's a lot of information. So we'll start from the beginning. First, we'll discover what we can about the 2 women with the wings of storks, because that's really it's really interesting. The first thing to note is that these spiritual beings lifted the ephah between the earth and the heaven, as it says. So I would suggest this is representing where the fallen angels reside, the second heaven we talked about. It's between heaven and earth. So it's lifting it up there. Now, what's also especially important to note is that these spiritual beings are women. Many times in Scripture, when trying to convey spiritual ideas and principles, shadows of real life are used. So one such example is using the idea of an adulterous woman as a shadow of idolatry, worshiping false gods or following false doctrines. We see that a lot. We see this in the book of Revelation when it refers to the whore of Babylon. The fact that these two spiritual beings are women could mean that they have some part in deceiving mankind away from God. Because what's the alien gospel? It's idolatry, because we're setting the aliens, above God, or worshiping false gods, obviously, and following false doctrines. So it could connect to that. So this can be further shown by looking at their description. We're told something really interesting. We're told that the two women have wings of storks. Now, what does that mean? There are two main places in the Bible where we can find references to storks and what they could represent. Leviticus 11:19 and Deuteronomy 14:18 tells us that God considers the stork as an unclean bird. So the stork was not kosher, basically. It wasn't meant to be eaten. Many times God will use unclean animals to represent spiritual uncleanliness and rebellion, other things of that nature. This shows us beyond a shadow of a doubt, no pun intended, that these, because they're shadows, get it? But it shows that these two women are not on the side of God. They're on the side of the enemy. All right, so they're not kosher, they're unclean, they're unclean spirits, if you look at it like that. Whether they're fallen angels or demons, I don't know. Probably, I really don't know. I don't know. I would just be speculating there. Well, some say that fallen angels and demons are the same thing, and I used to believe that too. It could be. I think they're different, but again, that's a whole nother study. We gotta stay on track here. All right, so going back, the two stork women, they might be an evil shadow of the two witnesses of Revelation. Now that might seem like a far leap or a stretch, but when we look at it, it actually kind of makes sense. So first, remember, for everything that God has, Satan has an evil and inferior shadow of it. These two women, as we'll soon discover, play a very important role in the establishment of the enemy and their false doctrines. And the two witnesses of God in the book of Revelation are sent to proclaim the truth and correct doctrine. So what is also interesting is that the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation starts off by making references to the measurements of the temple. And this is exactly how Zechariah 5 starts off with the flying scroll vision. We read of the measurements. So first, before anything else, the measurements pointing back to the temple are described. After the measurements in Revelation, the very next thing discussed is God's two witnesses. So in Zechariah 5, after the measurements are discussed, the next thing is the Ephah vision with these two stork women. They're polar opposite of the two witnesses of God in every way. So these two stork women will play a part in the spiritual aspect of promulgating the lie that brings about the apostasy, while the two witnesses of God will be trying to call back humanity with the truth. So there's definitely a shadow there. It's a evil and inferior duplicate. Satan always does that. Satan doesn't have an original thought of his own, so he has to take from God and twist it around to his own devices. All right, so next we can find out what the two stork women have to do with the ephah itself. And what I find to be probably the most interesting verse of this entire chapter, verse 11, we find out the true purpose of the ephah, the woman in the ephah, and the stork women carrying the ephah. We learn that the two stork women are taking the ephah, as it says, to build it an house in the land of Shinar, and it will be established and set there upon her own base. So we have a reference to an establishment, such as what we looked at earlier concerning the establishment of the eye. And we also have a reference to Shinar, which was where the Tower of Babel and later city of Babylon was built. The Hebrew word here used for build in this verse is not only referring to a physical act of constructing a dwelling, but also could refer to a rebuilding of a structure or even the building up of a family, which is really interesting. The rebuilding aspect could be a direct reference to the Tower of Babel that is discussed in Genesis 11. This has all sorts of shadows tying back to Nimrod. The Nimrod and the first one world government system and one world religion and the false doctrines the people practice, and even back to the idea of Nimrod himself attempting to contact the fallen angels and enter heaven. Now, again, I've gone to extensive detail concerning Nimrod and Tower of Babel and this idea of the attempted contact of the fallen angels in my book Disclosure. So for our purposes here, we only need a brief review. And so that's what we did. So we also learned that this house or family that's to be built, it's going to have the Ephah as its base. The Ephah itself, with the woman wickedness, will be the very foundation of the building. This is where all of the false doctrines, idolatry, the worship of false gods, this is where it'll have its revival. It'll originate here in the land of Shinar, just as in Genesis with the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel was the place of man's original collective rebellion against God. I believe we can look at this as a shadow for what's to come in our prophetic future. Just as Nimrod attempted to reach into the heavens, enlist the fallen angels, and overthrow God, we'll see mankind reach out into the heavens towards our supposed alien creators, enlist their help when they come to offer it, and strip God out of all human belief. At that point, mankind won't even have a use for God because the so-called proof of the alien gospel will be tangible for the whole world to see. Now, that is the coming great deception we must all be aware of so we can guard against it when that day comes. If we need to wait, we do need to wait on Jesus and look for his return first and foremost, so we need to always be prepared to meet Jesus. But we must also know how to defend against any deception or attack of the enemy before Jesus returns. We need to know how to deal with that. So this woman in the Ephah is the ultimate spirit of false doctrine. I believe this is the same woman that is referred to as the whore of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. We're told in Revelation 17:15 that the woman sits on many waters, which is representative of all peoples, nations, and tongues. So it's a worldwide deception. We also learn at the end of chapter 17 of Revelation that the whore is also a great city. So this can relate back to the woman in the Ephah. A house was built upon the base of the Ephah containing the woman. Now, whether this is the literal location of this city or not is beside the point. There's a lot of speculation as where that's going to be, whether it's in America or whether it's New York City or Jerusalem or whether it's a revived Babylon. It really doesn't matter at this point to understand this, because wherever it'll manifest on earth, it's the source of the deception, but it's a worldwide deception, so it's going to be everywhere. Another very interesting verse is Revelation 18:2, which reads, "And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird." Now, this is a description of the fall of the city of Babylon that was represented by the woman. We learn that it has become the habitation of devils and foul spirits, but next we get a really peculiar description. We're told that it has become a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, we found out earlier that the stork is an unclean bird, and it was the description of a stork that Zechariah attributed to the two women carrying the ephah. So I believe this could be a reference to the two stork women. We're told it's a habitation of devils and foul spirits. Well, the stork women are definitely, devils or foul spirits. And then the whole unclean and hateful bird thing that has become a cage of every unclean and hateful bird, well, they're referred to as storks. So if we look at it in that context, the very city and deception that they were trying to implement has become their cage because, there is no escape from God's judgment. So that's just interesting. There's one more important shadow that I want to address concerning the flying scroll and the vision of the ephah. In Leviticus 16, we read of the two goats that were used for atonement. Um, we read that one goat was to be slaughtered while the other goat was to be abandoned in the wilderness for a scapegoat. That's how it's worded. The goat does not become a scapegoat. A lot of times that's taught that that the goat is the scapegoat, but it's not. The goat is for a scapegoat. Oh, now what does that mean? It's really interesting that the word scapegoat, as used there, it actually comes from the Hebrew word Azazel, which is a name that comes from the Book of Enoch. Now, I don't have a problem going into extra biblical texts when they actually match up with the Bible, and I just think this is a really interesting parallel because Azazel, according to the Book of Enoch, was one of the 200 watcher angels that fell from heaven to mate with human women. It's the same event that's described in Genesis chapter 6. So in Enoch, it said that Azazel was basically the worst of all the 200, and when God judged the fallen angels, all sin was ascribed to Azazel. So this is why in Leviticus, one goat was slaughtered for atonement, and one goat was abandoned in the wilderness for Azazel, for a scapegoat. Azazel is the scapegoat. That's the word the translators used, for the English word scapegoat for Azazel. So we can look at the two goats as shadows of the two visions in Zechariah chapter 5. The first goat was to be slaughtered for atonement. We can see this as a shadow of the vision of the flying scroll because the flying scroll came to bring about judgment and cleanse the entire world of sin. What the first goat's job was for the people of Israel, the flying scroll's job is for the entire world. You see, and now the second goat, and of course in the first goat that ties back to Jesus and everything, and so does the scroll. Jesus has the scroll, Jesus is the sacrificial lamb, all that stuff. So now the second goat that was sent out to Azazel can be a shadow of the vision of the ephah because the goat was to be sent out into the wilderness to Azazel who, as recorded in the book of Enoch, was judged and buried somewhere in the wilderness until the time of the final judgment. So when Azazel fell, he brought all sorts of deception to mankind that made mankind turn from God. That is exactly what we see with the woman in the ephah. She is buried, in a sense, in the wilderness, and the establishment of the enemy is built upon her. This is to bring about all kinds of deception that revolve around a return of the fallen angels in physical form, masquerading as our alien creators. So these are all biblical shadows that we can use to gain deeper insight into what's being taught. We can use these shadows to gain more perspective into our prophetic future, and it's through these shadows that we can be better prepared for the days ahead. So, since we got some time, now that we've looked at the scroll and the ephah, I guess we can get into the Zechariah's vision of the horses. Now, I've already talked a lot about the horses in this show. It was in one of the maybe episode 3 or 4 or 5. One of the earlier episodes, I talked about the horses that I wrote about in Disclosure, and I wrote extensively in Disclosure about the horses. And then there I showed how we could look at the horses in one way, and then here I can show that it could be possibly a different way, and really they could even be connected, the two different interpretations. So as I said, I wrote a lot about Zechariah's horses in my book Disclosure, so some of this will be like a brief review. Now, in Disclosure, I showed how the horses of Zechariah 6 could be connected to the religion of Islam and a possible prophetic fulfillment. While I do believe that's a possibility, I can see another possibility that ties back to the alien gospel, apostasy, and a possible return of the Nephilim. And that's what we'll be looking at here, and I think it's important because it does tie back to the flying scroll and Ephah if they are representing the alien gospel. I believe it could at least be a part of it, if not the whole thing. So in Zechariah 6 is where we find about the horses. I think that this could be referring to the same thing. So in Disclosure, my book Disclosure, we discovered the connection between the grizzled and bay horses of Zechariah chapter 6 and the pale green horse of Revelation chapter 6. We also discovered that the horses of Zechariah were set out to fulfill the will of God, while the horses of Revelation are set out to fulfill the will of the enemy. So, taking the biblical descriptions back to the original Hebrew and Greek languages, we were able to see the significance of the colors of the horses to show that the agents of the enemy are nothing more than an inferior duplicate of the angels of God. So, before wrapping up this whole study and the horses and everything with Zechariah, I want to touch briefly on another possible interpretation of these horses. And again, for the background on this, my book Disclosure is available on my website, www.ministudyministry.com, for the background into this. But what I want to look at is another possible interpretation, and one that could be more likely given the fact that Zechariah 5 seems to be saying the same thing. Now, it's entirely possible that the pale green horse of Revelation, it could be representing the alien gospel and a possible return of Nephilim. Now, what do I mean by pale green? Because in the King James Version, it just says a pale horse. Well, when we take that back to Greek, it's the word chloros, which can mean pale or green. It's like green. It's used to describe the green grass. I believe it's in Revelation 9. So we can look at it as like a palish green kind of color, and it goes back to the grizzled and bay horses of Zechariah and all that. But now we know from Zechariah that the horses of God were brought to the earth with heavenly chariots. Now, as I discussed in Disclosure, it's important to note that the horses were not pulling the chariots. The horses were inside of the chariots. Usually when we think of, the chariots of God, we'll see, like, I remember in Sunday school, growing up in a Baptist church in Sunday school, we'd have all these, like these illustrations and these picture books. And when it would get to about the chariots in heaven, it would show like these Roman-style chariots pulled by horses up in the sky, basically. But when we really look at the descriptions, that's not what we're looking at, because the horses in Zechariah, they're inside of the chariots. So whatever these chariots look like, the horses are inside of them. So whatever the proper interpretation and definition of these heavenly chariots are, it would seem that the enemy has an evil and inferior duplicate or shadow of them as well. So, God has his chariots that he used to transport the horses to earth in Zechariah. Well, it seems like Satan has an evil and inferior duplicate of these chariots, and I believe that very well could be what we're seeing as UFOs. And these supposed alien spacecraft. Now, whether these UFOs are completely physical or spiritual or something in between, I don't know, but it would seem that they mimic the real chariots of heaven. And I believe that this is really what people have been seeing really forever. I mean, people have always been seeing strange things in the skies, and we're seeing them today. And I think it's maybe occasionally it might be a chariot of God, but I think more often we're seeing the enemy's chariots. That's what the UFOs are, and they're used to promulgate this lie of alien creators and all that. So since the horses that Zechariah saw were brought to the earth with chariots, it would make sense that Satan will do something similar when the time of the pale green horse comes. I can see this as a physical manifestation of the chariots of the enemy being portrayed as alien spacecraft. If Satan decides to, once again, steal an idea from God and twist it to suit his own desires, the pale green horse of Revelation could be signifying the physical appearance of UFOs and the promulgation of the alien gospel throughout the entire world. And Zechariah 5 would seem to corroborate that. So the pale green horse could be signifying the great apostasy itself. The fourth seal of Revelation could be the arrival and worldwide acceptance of the coming great deception. At the very least, it could be a shadow pointing toward the end-time fulfillment of the falling away of the church. So it's something that we should look out for. Now, all throughout this study, we've looked at some things, and while some of the conclusions that I've presented might be speculative, and they are, that I'm perfectly fine admitting that. Like I said, I'm not going to proclaim something as truth unless I know. These are speculative, and that's okay. But we must keep in mind that what we're dealing with here. We're trying to look ahead in time with the Bible as our guide to determine what is in our future. Now, the problem with biblical end-time prophecy is that it's incredibly subjective. Conversely, the exciting thing about biblical end-time prophecy is that it's incredibly subjective. We get to choose how we're going to handle it. That's why I love it so much, because you're always learning something new. You might have an idea for years, and then just when the time comes for it, it might prove to be different. I love that. I think that's so cool, and it does kind of keep us humble too. As long as we're honest with ourselves. But if we want to remain stubborn and prideful, we'll let our differences in eschatology lead to arguments and division within the church. Now, I believe that's a trap set by the enemy. But however, if we can get over ourselves and forsake pride, embrace humility, and discuss these things in humbleness, we'll find that there's a great deal of knowledge and wisdom that can be achieved. We can discover that we hold great strength in our differences if we remain a single body. It's okay to have differences about stuff. We're going to. We don't know everything. God knows that. We don't know everything. We need to agree on the stuff that we do know, like who our Savior is, that kind of stuff. But when it comes to matters that, for one thing, aren't salvation matters or aren't described, to a T in the Bible, but are just kind of referenced to, we need to look at that and allow possibilities, and people can have different opinions because none of us has all the answers. The best we can hope for is to have a few small pieces. And what we can discover is that other people have a few small pieces as well. However, we must also realize that God still holds some of the pieces for himself. He doesn't reveal everything. So until we actually arrive there in the prophetic timeline, we'll never be able to see the entire picture. All we can do is the best we can with what we have. If we reason together as a single body and come at this in a like-minded way, we can all contribute our pieces, work together, and finally begin to put this enormous eschatological puzzle together. But, outside of that, we must learn to let God fill in the blanks himself with his own pieces and in his own perfect timing. Because it's all God's. He's the only one that declares the end from the beginning. He's the only one that not only has already been there, but is there now, and is also here, and is also back there. He's everywhere. He's the only one that can see it all. We can't. So it's okay to have differences. We can't be so prideful that we just shut everybody else out and then expect to be prepared. We're not going to know everything. So that's the main point that I want to get across in this, is that while many of the conclusions are speculative and there are different ways to look at different things, as long as they can be backed up with the Bible, we should file it away as a possibility at least. I can't tell you that everything that we just looked at, that all of my interpretations are absolutely correct. I can't say that. I don't know. I believe they are, but when it actually happens, it might be something different. Or even given further research and study, there might be even another way to look at it, such as with the horses. When I wrote Disclosure, I saw Islam all over that, and I still do, but now I can see a second possibility with this alien gospel thing, and now I actually think that's a stronger possibility. It doesn't negate my first conclusion of Islam. It could be both. It's just different ways of looking at it, and they can be backed up. They're not heretical in any way. There's nothing in there that's like offensive to God. We're just trying to figure out what's going to happen before it does, based on the information God's given us. And God has given us enough information to be prepared, and that is the main thing we need to keep in mind. We have to be prepared. It kind of goes back to the whole idea of the rapture, or when the rapture is going to happen, that we Christians tend to get all worked up about. It's in a sense, it's almost kind of a non-issue if we're always prepared, because it doesn't matter if it's because of the rapture or because we die, because we could die at any time. We should always be prepared to meet Jesus. So we need to be prepared for this stuff, because however it's going to play out, it is going to play out in some way. That's a promise from that the Bible makes from God. He let us know this stuff ahead of time, and he gave us enough information to be prepared. He didn't give us enough information to have all the answers. That was never the point. That was never the idea. It was enough information to be prepared while still trusting in him. See, if we had all the information ourselves, how much trust would we really have in God? We would trust in our own knowledge. And a lot of times, even with our limited knowledge, we still have more trust in our own knowledge than we do in God. And I believe that's a big reason why he's kept some of this stuff for himself. We need to trust him to fill in those blanks for us when the time comes to do so. In the meantime, we just have to remain spiritually prepared, live every day like you could meet Jesus immediately, and keep our garments clean, as it says. So that's the main thing that I would like for you to be able to take away from this is, yes, the whole alien deception thing is important, but just more than that, be prepared every minute of every hour of every day of your life to meet Jesus. You just never know when it's going to happen. So all that being said, that does conclude our show. That concludes our study. That concludes this episode. We have some great great episodes coming up in the next weeks. I think next week we have Dr. Ken Johnson to talk about the Gnostic Gospels. After that, we have Johnny from the Iron Show. So we got some great shows coming up. So look forward to those. So I want to, in the meantime, I want to thank you for listening. I do pray that this show has become a blessing, and if for any reason, if you would like to donate to keep this show going, I do have a donate button on my ministry website. Again, www.ministudyministry.com. We are not a 501c3. We're not affiliated with any of that, so your donations, you won't be able to claim them on your taxes, but we don't really want to get involved in all that for reasons that should be obvious. Not saying that churches or ministries that are involved are wrong. It's just a personal choice. But so we can't really get into the whole tax thing. But if you would like to, if you'd like to send us a donation or a love offering or a gift or whatever, however you want to look at it, you can donate there, or you can buy a book. That's a great way to do it too, and then you get something out of it as well, apart from just feeling good that you gave freely. But again, I'm not the kind of person that pressures anybody into tithing, or I'm not into all that. Just do what God leads you to do. If he's not asking it of you, then don't do it. Don't worry about it. Just keep listening. We're never gonna charge for this show or anything. It's always gonna be free. But any donations that we do get, it does help the ministry. It does help us have what we need to stay on the air, keep this thing going, and also check out the other shows within the Axe Radio Network. Sometime in the future, I don't know exactly when, but I am hoping to get the hosts of the other show on my show as a type of introduction. So that is still in the works, and I don't know for sure if or when that's going to happen, but I am looking into that. But the other shows that are on here are great. I would highly suggest checking them out, and I'm sure there's ways to donate to them too, or even just the Axe Radio Network if you choose to do so. I'm sure there's a way to do that. The guy to contact about that would be the leader of our little rag band troupe of hosts here. His name's Paul Kennedy. He's a great guy. He's got an awesome show too. So check that out. All that being said, that does conclude our show, and I guess that's it. So again, I want to thank you for listening, and as always, take care and God bless.